If climate change is a serious threat and sea levels are going to rise or are rising, why don't we see real estate prices drastically decreasing around coastal areas? They keep shoveling sand back toward the water to regain what the shoreline looked like. Especially after a storm. I know the state of Florida is known for doing this. They won't give up an inch of that real estate. This is already a reality in some parts of Denmark, not because of rising sea levels, but because of the increased frequency of long-duration storms with northwesterly winds. These storms frequently flood coastal areas, and house prices, especially in Roskilde Fjord, have seen a decrease. Why do people in CA live in the mountains where it's often more expensive, e.g. Malibu Canyon, Mulholland Drive, Calabasas, etc., when there's always a huge risk of fire? I think it's because humans tend to enjoy living by nature, and also rich people like to flaunt living by the beach, mountains, etc., and don't really think about rising sea levels and all that, especially if they can just move. Realtor and SFL. Insurance prices have jumped in flood-prone or high-risk flood areas, so there's evidence the market and customers are responding to the change in risk. In the uninsurable markets, much of waterfront property is purchased with cash, by deep pockets that can afford to take the risk and enjoy the coastline wherever it happens to be that year. Because people who own these properties aren't going to drop their prices, sea levels won't rise for a long time either. I don't know why people associate this with the biggest problem of climate change. The biggest issue that will arise is a collapse of our food chain, that we won't be able to produce enough food to feed our global population, probably be some issues with water stemming from that. As soon as banks start saying we're not giving loans to homes in these areas, then you will see massive devaluation. If you are a seller in these areas, you will need to find an all-cash buyer that does not believe in climate change. Until then, people love living by the water for obvious reasons, so they are willing to take the risk. Current estimates project sea levels to rise so slowly that the real damage will be in 100 years from now, and U.S. houses are not made to last that long anyways, so it's not something you'll see priced into the value of current real estate. Related are wildfires in California, which are being exacerbated by climate change. People are still buying houses out here and property values are as absurdly high as ever, but one new development is that it's now near impossible to get fire insurance. In high-risk areas, anyhow. Insurers know it's a financial disaster just waiting to happen and don't want to risk it. Because it is not a certainty and nobody can predict whether it will happen in 2020 or in 2120 or never, people are short-minded, forget everything after a short period, because of life, problems, responsibilities, and the simple fact that most don't really care. As a subset of this question, I'd be curious about how the corporate market for real estate looks in low-lying areas, e.g. Silicon Valley, New York. I think largely the reason real estate hasn't plummeted is most consumers aren't thinking that long-term. Corporations, however, tend to be more likely to factor in such considerations in their long-term financial planning. As is usually the case in property markets, speculation can keep prices high long after the underlying values of the property have fallen. This effect is where property bubbles come from. When the breaking point arrives and buyers can no longer justify paying the listed prices, we call it bubble bursting. The simple answer is that it's not imminent. It's the exact same reason Houston, Miami, Hawaii still have valuable property. Basically, people gamble that it won't happen to me, consciously or subconsciously. Plus, balancing with trust in insurance companies and balanced with the benefit of living there. It actually does make sense that real estate prices aren't impacted much. Coastal areas have always been desirable places to live. Despite the all-consuming knowledge of climate change, people still want a nice view and a sea breeze. Not to mention most of the world's major cities are coastal. So even if you did fear the effects of climate change, people may not be able to move away due to work, family, money, etc. I'm not sure surrounding the science of it all, but I can tell you as someone forced to live in a coastal town that while purchasing we actively avoided places on the oceanfront and around lakes, streams. The flood insurance is exorbitant and often enough to leave those houses on the market often for months and sometimes years. We pay some flood insurance with a hurricane rider. If I remember correctly, federally subsidized flood insurance is partly responsible. Also, every time the coast gets hit hard, the old houses are destroyed and then get rebuilt into nicer, newer houses. Someone wrote a book about this happening in New Jersey. I forget. Because the seller wants the most money for the house, and I don't think the seller is going to worry about the buyer worrying the house will be damaged in a flood or something. So they have an excuse to sell it for full price. I'd assume it's because there's very high demand for coastal properties but limited supply, and for this segment of homebuyers the premium cost of living on the coast does not outweigh the risk of sea levels rising. There are a lot of wealth that they buy for the moment and not for savings for the future. Simple. Most clients have other property to quell for any issues including tropical storms and/or king high tide floating to hurricanes. Prices of houses prone to flooding after hurricanes decreased in Texas and especially Houston. Some really high-end and expensive neighborhood lost a lot of their house values. There are $1 million houses with backyards opening to a lake. So, IDK. But in Cali, lots of rich folks keep buying houses in the hills and risk life and property with frequent earthquakes and inevitable evacuations due to fires. Seeing how that continues, I'm not surprised that rich folks still want to live by the beach. Gene Hackman aka Lex Luthor was playing the real estate gamble by detonating nuclear warheads along the fault line which would have plummeted California into the ocean. Superman stopped him then and Superman will save us now. From a non-scientific POV. Because PPL or PPL. They want to live in pricey places for a variety of non-logical reasons and only think of now. Also PPL are greedy and will take advantage of those mindsets as long as they can. Buyer beware. It's far enough off that most people buying real estate don't think of it, and even if it does flood the government will pay you to rebuild. Same reason why people are still buying property anywhere there are frequent natural disasters. There's either money to be made or that's where they want to be. You could say the same thing about areas that are prone to natural disasters, like earthquakes. People are not that great at assessing long-term risk, and short-term considerations are often more important drivers of price. Coastal areas are generally pretty, have good economies, and offer lots to do. People value that more than some threat that seems decades off. I recently listened to a report discussing the rising costs of rebuilding coastal communities along Barrier Island around the world due to rising sea levels. Problem is that every time these islands suffer a hurricane or rising waters, FEMA, taxpayers, foot the bill of repairs. They are in many places. Large swaths of coastal Florida land are plummeting in price as building restrictions get tighter and tighter, coastal France too. Some cities are building pump-out systems with levees and elevated gravel-based roadways to extend the usable span of the areas, as there are massive hotels and condos that aren't easy to relocate. I had a coastal house that got flooded and I sold it for what I bought it for and consider myself lucky. I live 100 feet above sea level now. If you can see the ocean can see you. It's the storms that will drive you away. Any sea level rise is barely perceptible so far. Because they're going to milk money out of it until people have to evacuate. Once cities start to go under, only then will you see prices decrease. People aren't the best at thinking ahead, and some of them are actually actively ignoring the problem so they don't have to deal with it. To be fair, it's going to work because it's their children that will deal with it, not them. You did see a pretty big drop in real estate prices in Lower Manhattan, FIDI after Sandy, since a lot of offices had to relocate and left their offices vacant after they reopened. A lot of those offices are slowly converting to apartments, so the rents are climbing back up. The average person isn't in tune with reality is why, they're more concerned with drama and whatnot. Same thing with asking why do people with little to no money spend above their means. They just aren't as aware as the more self-aware and intelligent people. Hence why there's only a small percentage of wealthy people. The rate of which an actual measure of the seas rising will not be catastrophic to most homes. We're talking about centimeters through hundreds of years. It has a great effect on many other aspects of the world, but likely not your beach house. Similarly, we could see the same phenomenon taking place in high-risk seismic areas, such as Southern California, the Pacific Northwest and BC, Canada. However, in this cases, economics and demand play a much bigger role in the scenario. There are many places where prices are dropping. Some higher-class places have taken measures to mitigate rising sea levels to keep their investments safe. For now. Eventually, things will get worse and you'll see those coastal areas being abandoned and the value will shift to properties near the coast in safe, higher areas. It is quite likely that Florida will be protected by dikes, because there's too much money in Florida real estate. One downside of dikes is that you no longer have a beach, which will hurt property values. Netherlands has many dikes. Same reason why people build houses in tsunami, earthquake zones. People don't build there because they believe earthquakes are a lie and scam by the government. They live there because ultimately it is good real estate for other reasons. Econ major here. People are still willing to pay the price tag as there is still utility left in the area. So likely until the area, property actually becomes inundated with floodwater or the government-run flood insurance condemns the property, people will still buy it. Because we, the taxpayers, give these people money to rebuild their homes. Last week on NPR there was a whole story about how these rich people who own second homes on the beach that they visit 2 weeks a year get bailed out by the government when something happens.